When we study architecture, you're taught that you're using a lot of materials that are never going to get returned to another use. They're basically used once. And there's a tremendous responsibility to what you do that lives beyond you. And that starts to give you the sense that as architects, we have a legacy, so that even if people don't know our name, they know the buildings, and they've lived in our buildings, so their lives are in those buildings. But the thing that happens also when you're in architecture school is you start to think that there are these architects who've created iconic pieces of architecture, and their names are known to us as students. We study them, they're heroes of ours, and so on. And we expect that those people who created this iconic architecture would live long beyond their actual lives. Yeah, Edward Larrabee Barnes was one of those people when I was, they created this iconic architecture, but whose name is almost unknown at this point.
Yeah.
And that was an amazing thing to me as I started trying to refresh my memory about some of the things he had done, because this building was built a year after I entered architecture school. This building is what we were taught. We've all seen these building types for so long that we're used to them. And the example I gave is that we've all heard Jimi Hendrix for 40 years now. But if you happened to be at the first concert that he gave after getting back from England, you would have said, what the heck is that? Well, in its day, this was that kind of building. When these buildings came around, they were neither accepted by the general public, nor were they accepted by orthodox modern architecture, because they were introducing the natural materials. They were this mix of regional architecture and modern, and it didn't pigeonhole. And so these were buildings that were heavily discussed in its day.
There are a couple of things that really are unusual about this building in the context of its era, and one of them is that he's using the materials in a way that blends with nature, where almost all of the architecture before that was really objects standing in contrast to nature. So that's one part of it. Also, he's keeping the scale light, so that what dominates is really the majesty of the trees, really. I mean, that's the dominant thing. The buildings and the walkway happen in that context rather than by the other way around.
Part of what's happening here is he's creating a rural environment for people who are coming out of cities. So he's created a little miniature town, a little village, but it's set into this rural landscape, and so he's drawn off of the materials of that rural landscape. This building very much touches the ground in a way that is very gentle. It sits up on those little pilasters. Probably looking at the drawings, these buildings floated. There was no fill underneath them to prevent animals from going underneath, but also it gave them this lightness as they sat on the ground. I mean, and that's the other thing that's really unusual, is this strong horizontality about this as a design element. Even though these little pavilions are comparably vertical when you see them on end, the composition is very horizontal, and then he's put the horizontal shingles on there. Everything about this has a horizontality, except that he pokes these almost square openings into it that contradicts that. But some of these
what do you mean by square openings? What would be a square opening?
Well, an opening it's almost the same height as it is wide. Those big panes of glass that we saw, and when we look at the drawings, we see these very large, almost square windows, which is, again, it's not quite square, which was an important point. Square windows never look quite square when you see them in real life, because you're looking at them in perspective. So the lesson of that era was always you made a window that was far enough out of square that it looked to be intentionally a rectangle. But in this case, he's taken them down to being almost square windows.
When you think of this as being started as a project 1 year after the Civil Rights Act of 1964, so this was started in 1965, according to the drawings, even. Clearly there was a big vision behind supporting what we would basically call diversity at this point. Saying that, okay, all of these people can mix, they can think together, they can cooperate together, and then you say, well, okay, what is this fundamentally? And fundamentally is a village. I mean, it was built to be perceived as, felt like a village. So there's an incredible social agenda, I think.
Yeah. I think in our region, when you think about landmark buildings, they're very often buildings from the 1700s or the early government buildings of Washington or something like that. There's comparatively few buildings that I think of that are really landmark modern buildings that at least at one time were world-class architecture. And this happens to be one of those buildings. The fact that it's remote and unknown, what's really significant to me about being out here is that it's very rare that you get to walk through a building that had this stature in its day, and there isn't an army of people around looking at it. And the fact that you thought to try to focus on the building and bring it back to light is important, because we all understand historic preservation of buildings that are 200 years old. What we don't necessarily always understand is preservation of buildings that happen within some of our Medicare-aged lifetimes. And I think that what's wonderful about this reminder is that it tells us about remembering not just the old buildings, remembering the buildings that were breaking new ground in their day. It reminds us that what we see didn't just happen out of the blue. It's an evolution of thought, and that these buildings like this may be imperfect when seen in today's light. We have expectations that have changed over time. But when seen in the light of when they were created, these were marvelous, wondrous, challenging, thought-provoking objects placed on the landscape, and in this case, in a very sensitive and creative way.